Glad to be here with you all. My name is Ewan McGaughey, and I work in law school, and this is the seventh lecture and discussion in the series on Labour's current economic policy. This week we're looking at water, food and forest, but mainly we're going to be focusing on water. And we have a brilliant discussant here this evening, Robb, who is a campaigner for Henley Mermaids, and also a councillor for South Oxfordshire Council. So super interested to see what Joe says in the second half. And thanks to all of you for coming as well. It is said that thousands have lived without love, but not one without water, in the poetic words of Auden in First Things First. A bit less poetic are the pledges from Keir Starmer when he was running for Labour leader, that public services should be in public hands, not making profits for shareholders, common sense prose, supporting common ownership of rail, mail, energy, and, of course, for today, water. When we got to the Manifesto of the Labour Party just earlier this year, things got a little bit more specific. Broadly, the environmental and water-related pledges were these. Labour will create 9 new national river walks, one in each region of England, and establish 3 new national forests in England, whilst planting millions of trees and creating new woodlands. Labour will put failing water companies under special measures to clean up our water. We will give regulators new powers to block the payment of bonuses to executives who pollute our waterways and bring criminal charges against persistent lawbreakers. We'll impose automatic and severe fines for wrongdoing and ensure independent monitoring of every outlet. We will introduce a land use framework and make environmental land management schemes, that's the replacement for the Common Agricultural Policy, so ELMS, work for farmers and nature. So in summary, and what we're going to go through today, we can identify sort of 3 main sets in the political pledges. First, we're putting failing water companies into special measures, and we'll go into what that really means in a bit. Second, we've got this, and related to that, I should say, we've got criminal prosecution of lawbreakers or polluters being promised. Second, we've got this pledge, and it's drifted to the wayside a tiny bit, which is supporting common ownership. Note the difference between common ownership and public ownership of water. And thirdly, environmental land management. The agricultural subsidy payment is meant to work in whatever way for nature and for farmers, plus this nice stuff like 9 new river walks, millions of new trees, and 3 new forests. Those are the pledges, and what we're going to do, as in every lecture, is go forward with a comparison to the big picture of international human rights, how the legal background in the UK actually works at the moment, and how that measures up against big goals that human rights set. We're going to look at England's international ranking, or the UK's international ranking in the data on how we're playing out at the moment, look at different models for reform, and the benefits and costs of reform. And then, of course, we'll get into discussion with all of you. First of all, human rights. The big picture is that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of themselves and their family, including food. And what does that have to do with water, you might ask? Well, according to the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the idea is that water, and the right to water, is implicit in the right to food. Kind of makes sense. And more specifically, what does this right to food/water mean? According to the UN Committee, the human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water. So safe, acceptable, and affordable, main things. And the human right to water is seen as being inseparable or indispensable for leading a life of human dignity, according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And sort of a broader idea as well. It's not just that we want drinking water, but this is part of our environment. And the UN Human Rights Council believes that the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment is one that certainly exists. And this is sort of brought together out of a number of different human rights instruments. It wasn't explicitly in the it wasn't explicitly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, but this idea of the right to a clean environment is certainly very present in human rights discourse today. But of course, human rights give us these big open goals, and how we actually realize the human rights in practice is a bit different. So how do we achieve human rights to clean water and a clean environment in reality in the UK today? So let's go through the legal background. Firstly, on how our water ownership and governance works at the moment, focusing on the big water companies that deliver your drinking water and manage your sewage, and really are in charge of much of the infrastructure in water basins. Secondly, the rules against pollution. And thirdly, a little bit on environmental land management, which, as I say, is replacing the EU's common agricultural policy. Okay, so the ownership structure of water in the UK is split between different nations around the United Kingdom. In England, water is privatised. In Wales, it was privatised, but then got into trouble, and so it was put into a not-for-profit organisation. This is all set up through the Water Act 1989. In Scotland, the water system remained public, and so Scottish Water is a public body. It has a board which is appointed by Scottish ministers of between 8 to 10 directors. No representation, by the way, for members of staff in the organisation or for the bill payers. But so you've got quite a different contrast between really public, not-for-profit and private around the United Kingdom. And of course, when you've got a privatised water company, the board of directors, as we've talked about in previous lectures, is essentially appointed by the incumbents on the board of directors. A water company will have shareholders, but they don't really do the appointments. The ones that do the appointments are the existing board. They appoint each other, they appoint their successors, and they pay each other as well. You might say, well, what is there to control water companies purely pursuing their own self-interest? What is there to stop directors paying themselves ever more at bill payers' expense? What is there to stop shareholders enriching themselves? Not very much from a competition point of view, because water companies have a monopoly in their water basin. Thames Water sort of does the whole of the Thames basin region. No competition. But what we do have is a regulator called Ofwat, in statute known as the Water Services Regulation Authority. It gets appointed by the Secretary of State, got to have at least 3 directors on its board. And Ofwat has a whole range of regulatory powers, and its duties are to protect the interests of consumers wherever appropriate by promoting effective competition. A bit funny, you might think, given that we don't have any competition in water basins, but there is a provision elsewhere in the Water Industry Act that envisaged the possibility that water could be pumped from one region through the pipes of another water company, so that people might have the ability to switch between water providers. It's just that that hasn't ever actually happened in the 35 years since privatisation. But there you go. Ofwat has a duty to protect consumers' interests only by promoting, on the current legislation, effective competition, which, as I said, does not exist. Ofwat also has a duty to ensure that investors have reasonable returns on their capital. So you might wonder why a regulator, which is usually there to tame the instincts of private corporate owners, has a duty to ensure returns on the capital for shareholders. And more bizarrely, in Section 2, where Ofwat's duties are listed, there is actually nothing about clean water or clean rivers or clean beaches. So that's all in the Water Industry Act, and that's been the same way since privatisation in 1991, when the Act was drafted, even through revisions by the Labour government in 2003, the last Labour government. If we contrast that to Scotland, there is a different regulator, the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, and it has what you might, what is a sort of generally more normal set of aims for a water regulator that we see in other countries. Its aim is to promote the interests of persons connected to the public water supply, not by promoting competition, but just promote their interests. In particular, through making sure that they have wholesome water at a reasonable cost. So there's a fairly sort of standard set of public regulator duties which exist for Scotland, but not for England. Ofwat has powers. The main powers that it has are to be able to impose conditions on water companies through the licenses that it gives out to water companies to run our water. This can include, and does include, price controls. So all the prices that you pay for your water bills are not market prices, they are fixed, they are determined by the regulator on a sort of ad hoc basis, depending on what it thinks is necessary for investment to get the outcomes that it wants. But remember, in Section 2, it's got a duty to ensure reasonable returns on capital for water companies. So it can set prices or conditions that it thinks requisite or expedient, and it also can give directions to water companies. Of course, whether that actually happens and what they do is very much dependent on who appoints Ofwat and what priorities the Secretary of State and the government have for Ofwat. Ofwat can also vary water companies' licenses, conditions and terms, and it can do this unilaterally. It did this once in, I think, around 2003 or maybe 2013, more than a decade ago, to ensure that water companies have 25 years' notice before losing their licenses. So if a water company is failing, not like a train company, which we saw a couple of weeks ago, it can't be stripped of its license without 25 years' notice unless we go through the special administration rules, which we'll get to in just a sec. Let's just say a little bit more about English water privatisation, because it is pretty astonishing. In the Water Act 1989, Section 4 and Schedule 2 transferred all the water authorities that were public and exist at the time to different successor companies, setting up regional monopolies around England and Wales. Then those successor companies issued securities. They sold shares in the water company to get the market value that they thought that they could. And the Secretary of State in Sections 84 and 85 was empowered to lend such sums of money as he or she thought fit, and to make changes to debts and write off debts. So during privatisation, the companies ended up being sold, if you added up the market values for all of them, for 7.6 billion. But along with that, incredibly good deal for the companies, £6.4 billion of existing debt that the water authorities had was cancelled, and so the government gave it aid. That's worth about £16.2 billion in today's money. Since privatisation, £85.2 billion has been paid out in dividends to the different companies' shareholders. So that's from 1989 up until 2024. And if you divide that by 35 years, that's about £2.5 billion every single year that's been going to water company shareholders. Where did they get all this money to pay out dividends? Well, one of the answers is that they loaded themselves up with £65 billion worth of debt up to 2023. That'll be slightly higher now because it's 2024. So you can kind of imagine just sort of companies being loaded up with debt, and those loans being given to the majority of the dividends that are being paid out. And of course, all the time these water companies are taking in bills. And the government in 2022 calculated what we know, the infrastructure is pretty poor. They need to spend £56 billion to fix all the problems. Now, that figure is hotly contested by lots of different groups. Of course, if you're a water company, you've got an incentive to inflate your estimates of how much repair workers need. And if you're trying to make the argument that public ownership is a bad idea, you want to inflate this figure so it looks really scary. But I think that we can safely say, whatever the government's calculation in 2002, that there is a few billion at least needed in infrastructure repairs to the water system. Okay, so what is the government now doing? We've got the pledge from the Labour Party in its manifesto to put water companies in special measures. And sure enough, it published the Special Measures Bill. So Clause 1 makes some changes so that Ofwat can issue new rules on company director remuneration and governance of water undertakers. And actually, I think this is really interesting because it's pretty broad. It covers all director remuneration and it covers water undertaker governance in general. It doesn't say anything more specific than that. But then if you look at the next subclause, it says that, so Ofwat may issue rules about pay and governance, but it must issue rules on performance-related pay. So you might have heard in the news this big spiel about the government wanting to ensure that directors don't get bonuses if water companies are polluting. So there are going to be rules which essentially ban bonuses if you've got a director of a water company that has polluted lots. Water companies have to draw up pollution incident reduction plans, basically saying what they're going to do. There are a few tweaks to the powers and duties of the Environment Agency and the Drinking Water Inspectorate, nothing major. And then, after the bill was published, because nothing was done with Ofwat and Ofwat's duties under Section 2, but the government has just issued last week, I think, or the week before, its own amendment to its own bill so that the Ofwat duties are changed. So what it does is it says that Ofwat has to have regard to duties in the Climate Change Act 2008, Section 1, and remember that is the target to get net zero by 2050, although we're already at 1.5 degrees of warming, and so really not going fast enough. But there we go, we've got to have regard, if we're Ofwat, to the climate change rules. You might ask, well, what connection does that have for water companies? Are water companies big emitters of greenhouse gases? Well, not really, but there are a lot of things that could be done, like solar panels on reservoirs that both conserve water and make the companies carbon negative. So there it is. And the more important one for our purposes is the Environment Act 2021. Duties have to be paid regard to, and this refers to some regulations that the last government issued, the environmental targets for water regulations in 2023, and the target through this long chain of sort of legislative maze are that agricultural water pollution from nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment has to be reduced by 40% by 2038. So that's quite a long time from now, 13 years or so, 14 years, 15 years since it was passed. And in Regulation 10, wastewater phosphorus, so that's basically the sort of active chemical that comes from sewage, has to be 80% lower by 2038. Not really a very striking set of targets, given how bad water pollution actually is. So we've got this new, to sum up, we've got this new soft duty on Ofwat to pay regard to environmental targets and the Climate Change Act. There's no duty on the water company themselves, right? So Ofwat, if this target is missed, it might have still had regard to it. There's no necessary legal remedy in judicial review, because it might have had regard to it, then just felt that it couldn't do anything. No duty on the water companies, so you can't sue them for breaching these targets. And of course, that's problematic because they're the ones that are actually profiting from pollution continuing. And all the duties regarding Ofwat promoting shareholder returns and the consumer's interest only through competition, those are all staying the same. There are a couple of clauses on special administration that we're going to get to in just a sec. And it essentially says if a water company fails, then the costs of the insolvency procedure or the reorganisation procedure can be put onto bill payers. There's no actual duty yet to put failing water companies into administration. Rules against pollution are pretty loose, mainly because the regulators have either not been doing an effective job or they have been actively defunded by the last government. So the main one that we can focus on for now is called the Environmental Permitting Regulations 2010, which comes from EU law, the Integrated Pollution Control Directive. And this says that if you're running a regulated facility, which includes water companies that discharge sewage water, then you need to have a permit to run the facility. Permits come with conditions, and it's an offence to breach the conditions. And the Environment Agency is meant to do the job of enforcing permit conditions. So if you've got sewage leaks into the rivers, it's probably going to be a breach of these rules, and it should be the Environment Agency that does something about it. Problem is, one of the problems among many, is that the Environment Agency's budget has been cut by about half since 2010. There's lots of duties on water undertakers under the Water Industry Act. One of them, for instance, is that sewage has to be effectually drained. So that means not, just sort of untreated sewage being dumped anywhere. It has to be effectually drained, which means treating and disposing of in a responsible manner so that it doesn't negatively affect the environment. But I mean, the big thing is, if you are a bad company, then surely you should lose your license to be a water company. This is what happens with trains, it's what happens with hospitals that we'll talk about next week that go into special measures, the management can be changed. If it's a private hospital, very few of those in the UK, but it can lose its right to run a hospital. Same thing for universities or schools, they can be put into special measures and you replace the people who are doing it. And we do have rules about that for water companies, and it's called special administration. So under the existing law, the Secretary of State or Ofwat can petition the High Court for a company to go into special administration for two reasons. Number one is if it's insolvent, and so the test in the law is if you're unlikely to be able to pay your debts as they fall due, then you are called, well, what we say, cash flow insolvent. If your liabilities outweigh your assets completely, your balance sheet insolvent. And this is one of the reasons that a company can be put into special administration. More importantly, for pollution, you can be put into special administration if you're a water company if you breached a principal duty that is serious enough to make it inappropriate for the company to keep doing its job. And a principal duty includes any of the license conditions set in your license by Ofwat. Remember, that's the contract that goes for at least 25 years, you need at least 25 years notice before it's cancelled, unless you have a serious breach of a principal duty. So that can be a license condition that's breached, or any of the statutory duties. So maintaining an efficient and economical water supply under Section 37 of the 1991 Act, providing a sewerage system that is effectually draining the sewerage. And this is special administration. It's different from normal administration from normal companies because of, well, two main things. Firstly, the government takes control of the administration and the restructuring process. And secondly, secured debts that are held by banks can be reduced or basically not paid off if a company is transferred to a new entity. Usually what happens in administration, if a company goes bust, is that the big creditors, the banks, who have got security interests over the company's assets, think of maybe you're familiar with like football teams, and you've got a bank that has a security interest over the stadium. If the football team goes bust, then the bank can physically take the stadium. Or everyone's familiar with how housing works. Bank takes a mortgage over your house. If you don't pay your mortgage back, then the bank can physically take the house. So that's the case in normal administrations for companies, but it's not for water because the legislation quite rightly recognised that it would be a bad idea for banks to take possession of reservoirs and people's drinking water if the company failed. So we don't let that happen. Schedule 3, paragraph 5 of the Insolvency Act modifies the general law so that charge holders, the banks, must get less. Normally they must get no less than the value in an open market by a willing vendor, and that is changed to the best price that the creditor could get, which is reasonably available on a sale which is consistent, here's the important part, with the purposes of a special administration order. And then you go, well, what are the purposes of the special administration order? Set out in section 23. It is, first of all, transfer to another company as a going concern to ensure that the functions which have been vested in the water company by virtue of its appointment may be properly carried out. What are the functions? That is all the stuff up here. Economic water supply, making sure that sewage is effectively drained, and so on. If a water company goes into special administration, the government takes control, and it could transfer the company, it can transfer the business, or all the reservoirs, all the pipes and so on, to a new company without paying off all the banks that have got security interests already. And that's the really crucial thing. We've had special administrations before in energy, we've had them in railways, where shareholders have definitely lost, and also bondholders are capable of losing. We've never done it yet in water, despite the massive scale of pollution that we see everywhere. Third main bit of regulation to keep an eye on is relating to agriculture. And so we used to be in the Common Agricultural Policy. Europe-wide, around a third of the European Union's budget goes on agricultural subsidies. We passed out those subsidies through DEFRA. Now we're all doing it ourselves, and of course there's a lot less money, so farmers getting a lot less in subsidies. And all of this is set out the way it's done in the Agriculture Act 2020. It just allows the minister very, very broad power to set any criteria for giving out agricultural subsidies. And subsidies can be tied to conditions for improving water and protecting the environment. So we're now calling the subsidies environmental land management payments, or ELMs. You see what they did there with the fun tree-like acronym. You can have any conditions that you like. Not been done yet to ensure clean water or reduce agricultural pollution. I should have said, one major source of pollution is, of course, sewage. Another major source of pollution in our water systems is agricultural runoff, basically slurry from, animal poo. And other things, chemicals. National parks can be designated under the 1949 Act after consulting with different councils and planning boards. Natural England is in charge of that. And the Forestry Commission has a duty to develop the growth and expansion of forests around the UK. Okay, so how do we measure up internationally? So we've gone through all of the sort of quick summary of the UK's legislative background. We've seen the human rights. How are we doing in actual outcomes on, and how do we compare in ownership and governance of water, on pollution and prices, and agriculture and forestry? Okay, this first chart I think is a good place to start. What this shows is countries around Europe. So by their acronym, there's the UK down there. And it shows the type of ownership structure of the water company. Now, I really, really want the data behind this chart so that I can turn into something that looks a little bit more manageable. But what's going on really is concentrate on the, what colour is that? Magenta. That's a publicly owned company. Blue is local ownership of your water company. And you can see that most of the chart is either blue or magenta. Then we've got green for a private operator that's delegated management by a public authority. We've got orange for a public-private partnership. And then, not much of this on this chart, except for one country, is privatised water. And so you see that the UK, so that's, I think that's probably Scotland. And then the rest of the UK, or maybe Scotland and Wales, the rest of the UK is privatised. And so we are an extreme outlier. The only other countries that have even a tiny bit of privatisation is Denmark and Estonia, a little bit in the Czech Republic and Cyprus. But the vast majority of water is publicly owned, or at the very least it's under tight control, state supervision, through a franchise or delegated management arrangement. Okay, so the UK is an extreme, and England is an extreme outlier in the extent of privatisation worldwide, and that is also in the OECD. How are water companies run in other countries which as I say, mainly public. And remember that Scotland just has Scottish ministers appointing the board of Scottish Water. English water companies have boards appointing their own successors subject to oversight by shareholders. But when we look at publicly owned water companies, more interesting things happen in their governance. So if you look at Berlin, in 2013, it was brought back into public ownership after being in private ownership for a while. The system that they set up was that half of what you call the supervisory board, which appoints the management, the day-to-day managers, half of the supervisory board is chosen by people on the Berlin Council, so that's the local authority represented on the board, and then the other half is chosen by members of staff. And so you've got the sort of public interest represented, people who are elected by bill payers, and you've got the people who are the real experts of how water is managed, the staff electing the other half of the board. And as we said in previous lectures, around Europe and the majority of OECD countries, usually at least a third of the board of all companies, not just water, is elected by staff. But here you see a sort of good model in Berlin. Eau de Paris, if you go to Paris, public since 2009, it was privatized before, they brought it back into public ownership. And they set up a system where you have 13 councillors on the board, so from the Paris Council, just 2 members of staff. France doesn't have a strong tradition of staff co-determination as Germany does. And then, interestingly, 3 representatives from consumer or environmental groups, and then experts who are non-voting. So you've got this sort of stakeholder representation model, not just sort of top-down appointments by the Scottish ministers or Whitehall in the UK. And if you go to the Netherlands, you've got Groningen Waterbedrijf. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but it has a 6-person board, 4 chosen by the council, 2 chosen by workers. So, 2/3, 1/3. So you have different models of governance around Europe which broadly represent stakeholders. How is water quality comparing between the UK and other countries in Europe? So don't worry about this stuff at the top, but broadly there are standards that don't apply to us anymore for the European Union that say everyone's got to have good clean drinking water and bathing water. This chart on the right shows the outcomes in bathing water quality around Europe. So this shows the percentage from Cyprus with 99.2% of bathing waters that are rated as excellent. So that's basically clean water that you want to swim in. And you go all around, and the ones that are doing worst are sort of basically in Eastern Europe and ex-Soviet countries. And there's Albania there, the 5th worst, 67.2. We're not on that chart, but we have our ratings from the EU laws that used to apply to us. And in the UK, it's just 66.4% of bathing waters that are rated excellent in 2023. So that's the 5th worst. We are even worse than Albania. We're just edging above Estonia, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. So we're really doing very terribly. So surely that means that we're not paying very much for water, because if we've got such terrible outcomes, surely we must be getting bargain prices. No, we are not. This chart shows the changes in water prices since privatisation. And you can see that it's gone down. It's not quite up to date, this chart, and you can see it's gone down at the end. But roughly speaking, you're paying about £100 more in real terms than you were at privatisation for your water. It costs £300 the average bill for water. Now it's on average £400. And water companies are now proposing, and this is what's going to be decided at the end of this year, that water bills should rise by 40% on average across England by 2030. So taking away inflation that's likely to happen by 2030, that's probably around 25 to 30% real terms rise. So if you put 25% on top of your £400 average bill, then that's another £100 in the next 5 years, 4 to 5 £100. It's worth noting that that's just England. In Scotland, bills are 10% lower, although Scotland is much better. It's not perfect on pollution. So when we compare around Europe, we've got the fourth highest bills, or the third highest, depending on how you measure, just after Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So this is what it looks like when you plot these two things next to one another. And this is just focusing on bills for domestic consumers. So you can see that there's a general kind of trend, if you like. Well, I mean, it's kind of all over the place, but generally speaking, we're sort of in this half of the chart, not that half. And this is bathing water quality on this axis. This is the cost of water on this axis. And generally speaking, the more you pay, the better it gets. These countries down here are countries with lower GDPs or per capita. So generally speaking, the more you pay for water, the better your water quality gets. Except the UK seems to be a pretty bad outlier. And the green dots refer to countries which have more than 60% of their water in public hands. Yellow if it's mixed, and red, the only one is really the UK, where we're predominantly privatised. Last sort of data point is on forests around the UK and England in particular. So this map shows forest coverage in Europe, and what you can see just there is that we've got a lot less dark green than everyone else does, because we've got very low forest coverage. It actually got super low just before the war, because lots of wood was burnt for fuel, and in World War I it was even lower because all the wood that remained was taken and used for trenches. The Forestry Act 1919 was passed for the Forestry Commission to try and drive up timber production, and so we've got much more than we did back then. 10.1% woodland coverage in 2021 in England. It used to be 15% when the Doomsday Book was compiled in 1086. The Climate Change Committee recommends that we aim for a UK-wide target of 18%, which comes down to getting up to 17.5% in England if we are to meet our climate change targets. And generally speaking, this could be done using the Agriculture Act powers for reforesting land, or the National Park powers, or the Forestry Act powers of the Forestry Commission. Okay, so what are the models and options for reforming where we are now? First of all, we could take the very simple step of making sure that failing water companies actually lose their licenses, and also ensure that the debts are scrapped, the debts to banks who have profited from pollution, got lots of interest payments already, so that all those debts are written off through the special administration and transfer process. And another model which is instructive is in the Netherlands. They actually have a ban on reprivatising water. So once water is put into public ownership, it can't go back into private ownership. And that is an option that we could follow and get better water like the Dutch. We could also change Ofwat's duties to focus directly on clean water, not shareholder returns or non-existent fake competition. That's what happens in Scotland. We could require water companies, whether they're public or private, to have stakeholder representation, workers and service user elected directors. And as I read the Special Measures Bill, that is a power that could be exercised to increase stakeholder representation in water companies once the bill goes through, which could be very good news. We could properly fund the Environment Agent by just going back to the funding that it had before in real terms, and that would help with stopping pollution. And we can make sure that subsidies to farms through the ELMS scheme come with conditions to stop pollution, not by the distant date of 2038 that is currently set in the regulations, but more immediately. And we could expand national parks and restore woods. to the Climate Change Committee's target. And I think that we could probably try to aim to do that a lot quicker than the 2030 target, because what the Climate Change Committee is calling for is basically an extra 12,000 square kilometres of woodland, and that is in fact just a tiny bit more than Italy planted already in the period from 2001 to 2021. So actually it doesn't need to take 25 years or, well, 30 years since the Climate Change Committee proposed it. It could happen much quicker, 20 years or quicker if you really tried. What would be the benefits and costs of at least some of these reforms? Well, firstly, if you didn't have private ownership of English water, you'd save probably, according to historic shareholder returns, £12.5 billion for bill payers over the next Parliament. And that's a simple calculation of £2.5 billion spent per year if we keep on doing the same thing by a 5-year Parliament. Secondly, if we didn't nationalise water companies, which the government says there is no money to do, but you put failing water companies into special administration and you use the rules as they could be and played tough with the New York vulture funds and hedge funds that are now buying up Thames Water debt, then you can write off the debt and take over the failing water company at no extra cost to the public purse. You don't need for that debt to come onto the public balance sheet. You don't need to bail out the banks. And stripping the worst companies of their water licenses will probably send a signal to other companies that are further away from failure. So if you look at Thames Water, which is incredibly indebted, probably the worst, or certainly one of the worst polluters, if you make an example for them, that can encourage higher standards amongst the other companies that remain in the private sector for however long that might be. And finally, one of the extra benefits from putting water back into the public sector, if you find a way around the incredible amount of debt that they've run up, is that you've got at least 40% extra money for investment in infrastructure if shareholders don't have to be paid anymore. So, I mean, that can be split in a number of ways. You could have lower bills, you could have higher investment, but there's 40% extra money to play with. And that comes from the figures on dividend payments from 1989 to 2023, 77.6 billion, compared to the capital expenditure that the water companies made of 191 billion. Okay, so questions for discussion are, what are the best ways that we can ensure an end to pollution and restore clean water? Secondly, should English water companies be placed in public ownership, and what is the best method to do that? What reforms, thirdly, if any, should be made to Scottish, Welsh and English water governance? And what reforms are desirable for agricultural policy, especially relating to water and the environment? So that concludes the first half, and I would now like to invite Joe Robb up to take a seat, and we can kick off the discussion. So, thank you, Joe. Thanks again for coming along. As I say, you're like a leading water campaigner. We met through various gatherings where we were trying to talk to people in Parliament about what the Water Special Measures Bill would be. I guess you're sort of also professionally interested in this as a councillor and I guess in the Thames Water Basin. Yes. So you're with England's most problematic company. So yeah, it'd be great to hear what you think about this or just something else.
Well, firstly, what an amazing presentation. And I learned a huge amount. I've been involved in this campaign for cleaner rivers for about 5 years now. And one thing that's become apparent to us as campaigners is that over the course of the past 5 years, the more we know about the scale of illegal sewage dumping, the scale of illegal pollution, what's become clear is what we're talking about is just the very shitty tip of an enormous iceberg of crisis that is coming towards us. So when we're talking about illegal sewage discharges, 2 million hours of untreated sewage being flooded into our rivers, lakes and seas last year, nearly 200,000 hours for Thames Water alone, so that's going directly into rivers. This speaks of 35 years of underinvestment, 35 years of, as you described, shareholders being paid dividends, creditors being paid eye-wateringly high interest rates on the debt that they're lending into these companies, which has meant that investment that should have taken place has not taken place. So we have some of the worst performance, environmental performance of any country in the world in terms of our water industry. And now what's emerging, particularly around Thames Water, is the scale of the investment deficit that we're looking at in terms of our freshwater supply. So we have 16 million people in Thames Water's area who are now living with, according to The Guardian, water supplies that are on a knife edge because of chronic failure to invest in freshwater infrastructure. Thames Water loses 25% of its freshwater to leaks. That's our water that is being treated for us, and they're losing it to their own leaks. And the other issues that are emerging are issues of IT security. Thames Water is using IT software from 1999. So this is now becoming a potential target for hostile states. So really, this is a matter of national security. And what concerns me is that Labor, despite a lot of tough talk, doesn't seem to be willing to grasp the nettle and take the action that is needed to ensure that we all have a safe water supply and that we have good outcomes for our environment, and also that we're paying reasonable bills. I mean, the graph you showed, I think that actually is very favourable to England, because that data from 2022 didn't include, or only included 2 stretches of river. We now have far more stretches of river that are being analysed.
This one.
Oh yeah, and most of the stretches of river with bathing water status that would fall within this data are at risk of losing bathing water status because water quality is so poor. So under the Bathing Water Directive, bathing water status would be revoked. So I think the picture that we're seeing there is actually favourable. We're probably far worse on environmental performance than that suggests. And bearing in mind places like France, Germany, and Austria, wherever they are, have hundreds of designated bathing areas on their rivers. France has about 600 stretches of river that are designated bathing areas. We have fewer than 20. So we haven't been using the law, whether it be environmentally or in terms of enforcing against these water companies to make sure they deliver on what they're supposed to be doing, which, as you said, is clean water for customers and sewage treatment. Yeah.
And actually, the data is quite hard to come by. So,
Yeah.
I would have loved to have looked at, not just bathing waters, but just pollution incidents and sewage discharges. But it's quite hard to find sort of European-wide data. And even this is incomplete, as you mentioned. I think Austria's not up here. Austria will probably. My guess is that Austria would be sort of in the top right, maybe not as expensive as Denmark. But you can't always get complete data. The European water authorities. Yeah. Good. And so, what do you think then are the ways that we get out? I suppose there's lots of ways to sort of skin a cat, but what really strikes me about the campaign groups that are around water is that many are regional. They care about what's happening in the end. But there's not necessarily sort of one line of what people think are the solutions. And so, and we had this huge march against water a couple of weekends ago. And the call seems to be like, do something, but then, what is that something? So what do you think are the sort of best solutions?
I agree with what you're saying, and one of the challenges that small local campaign groups like mine have faced is that increasingly, as I said, we've become aware that this crisis around pollution is indicative of a far deeper crisis, and it's led all of us, local groups, some of the more prominent local groups, to the inescapable conclusion that the core of this problem, the root cause of this problem, is the privatised model itself. So we have joined, we're the Henley Mermaids, we've joined together with 4 other campaign groups around the country, and we're calling ourselves the Sewage Campaign Network. So it includes Save Windermere. Many of you have probably seen what's going on in the Lake District's most iconic lake, the jewel in the crown of the Lake District, which is on the verge of ecological death. SOS Whitstable, the Ilkley Clean River Group, which was the first group to secure bathing water status for a stretch of river in this country, and a very famous group called Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, who have probably done more than anyone, including the Environment Agency, to draw attention to the crisis around illegal sewage dumping. but we're joined together as a group who are calling for an end to the privatised model, because it's become clear to us as campaigners that the only way to protect our rivers and to protect the people who depend on these water companies is to bring them back into public ownership and back into public control. So it's interesting that you ask about the March for Clean Water, because I left that march thinking I'd seen amazing, fish and incredible, displays that people made and wonderful banners, and it was a beautiful march. But what was it for? And I thought one of the best speakers was the speaker from the GMB Union, who made it abundantly clear that the GMB and the union movement stands absolutely against the continuation of this legalised scam of privatisation. And I mean, I think we talked about some of the data that speaks for itself. As Thames Water customers, about a third of our bills go on servicing debt. And that's about to increase. Each household, each Thames Water household will have to pay an extra £50 a year if the company's £3 billion credit lifeline is approved by the High Court. So each of us will be stumping up an extra 50 quid a year to keep Thames Water in private ownership. And the question becomes, what more do we have to do? What has to happen for government to recognise that the scam has to end? I mean, last week I shared an article with you from my former editor. I used to be a financial journalist covering the capital markets, so this is something I'm quite familiar with. I'm quite used to talking about the cost of servicing debt. And the primary cheerleader of the capital markets, called Global Capital Magazine, is calling for Thames Water to be renationalised. Now, when we get to, for different reasons to what I would argue, clearly, I mean, their argument is that Thames Water is a bad neighbour, that it is harming privatisation because it is so chronically indebted, it is failing so badly that it needs to be taken out and shot for the good of the rest of the industry. So, I mean, I would argue that the whole industry should be brought back into public ownership as and when appropriate. But we know that something's bad when the cheerleaders of private capital are calling for Thames Water to be put into special, well, not even special administration, renationalisation. Yeah.
Yes, and so let's just unpack that a little bit. I mean, so on the March for Water, you have lots of different types of groups, and some people are in the Green Party, some people are Labour supporters, some are Lib Dems, some, I dare say, might even be Conservatives, because they genuinely care about conservation of their water resources. But it also seems like a lot of people would support public ownership. Even Conservatives, when we see polling data, the numbers are over 80% for broad public support for water ownership. But then the question becomes a bit more tricky on how do you get there? Because if you nationalise the water company, then you take on its debt. If you buy it, then you buy the debt as well as paying whatever compensation to shareholders. And if water companies were really paying for the pollution they cause, then maybe there wouldn't be any market value that you pay to shareholders, but you'd still have to pay, you'd still have to hold their debt. So how do you get there without, I mean, Rachel Rees is worried about the £22 billion black hole. So I mean, what would you say to Rachel if she was sitting here I don't know, assuage her worries about adding to the national debt?
Well, the first thing I would say is that Labour has committed itself, rather, it's committed to this fiscal straitjacket. It's decided to pursue limitations to its own ability to borrow and spend, and that's what it's decided to do. So they're very clear that they don't want to add more debt to the national balance sheet. I would argue that that is false economy anyway, because particularly when we're talking about water, at the moment Thames Water is accessing the debt markets at a rate of 9.75%. Most of us could access the debt markets more cheaply than Thames Water can. I'm not even joking.
Yes.
You or I could borrow more cheaply than Thames Water can. Every public entity can borrow more cheaply than Thames Water can, and certainly government can borrow more cheaply than Thames Water can. So if we're talking about, in the case of Thames Water, special administration, you've touched on the ways in which much of the shareholders would be wiped out, and I'm sorry to say that is capitalism. And that's the nature of capitalism. That is the system that we're in.
Shareholders, but what about the banks that own the debt?
Well, when the administrator would be going through the credit hierarchy, shareholders would be at the bottom of the hierarchy and would lose everything. But you would start with, the tax man, whatever else, and then you go through your bondholders, your senior secured debt holders, and then you go through your unsecured debt holders, your people who mow the lawns, they get nothing. The guys who mow the lawns get nothing. But this is essentially about a company restructuring of the sort that happened under Railtrack. If the government has to take on any of that debt, there would be a simple case to argue that it would refinance that debt at far lower levels than Thames Water is currently paying to its creditors. Much of that debt, or most of it, all of it, is trading at distressed levels. So investors, people who are currently holding that debt, most of them are vulture funds who have bought this debt in the secondary markets and are taking a big risk. These bonds, these loans that they've bought in the secondary market are paying big coupons. So they're taking a risk. They've decided they're willing to take that risk. Most pension funds won't touch this stuff because it's toxic debt that is they're likely to lose the house. So these are vulture funds, many of them from America and elsewhere, that are gambling big, and the nature of that is that you can lose big as well. So I don't think that in a capitalist system, even Jacob Rees-Mogg has talked about the fact that if we have a privatised system, we can't be sending a message to investors that their shares, their debt is going to be underwritten by government, and at the same time provide them with enormous coupons and enormous returns that are akin to private sector returns, but with public underwriting. It's totally inappropriate. There's no other industry where that's going on.
That's really interesting. I want to open it up for questions and discussion from the audience. Perhaps I could just ask one more question first, which is the government has said it's going to pass this special measures bill, which is currently in the process of amending, which is kind of interesting because they realise that they made pledges in the manifesto, they haven't got everything in there. So you've got more amendments in the order, maybe there could be more in the Commons to come. But then it's talking about doing a review after that. And it's saying no to nationalisation. Query whether it means a different thing to special administration and all of the stuff about taking back into public ownership and writing off debt. But it's also mooted this idea of not-for-profit water companies. I mean, what I'm interested, I suppose, is what do you think the ideal model would be if you could have a not-for-profit company, but that be worse than a publicly owned company? And I'm also interested in what you think about the governance of the water company, because I suppose there's a narrative that we don't necessarily just want to go back to old-style nationalisation, sort of pre-Thatcher. What would you say about the review and also the governance?
Well, firstly, I would say that the review is disappointing because the review has explicitly ruled out looking at models of ownership. It's explicitly ruled out looking at public ownership. As you say, they've indicated they would consider social enterprise models, which I would welcome, looking at the possibility of social enterprise models. On my council, and CAP's council, our leisure services are provided by GLL, which is a social enterprise. It pays the real living wage to its staff. All profits that are generated are put back into the company. It's a great company. Is it the best way to run a water monopoly that serves 16 million customers? I'm not sure that it is, not least because it can't borrow at the cheap rates that government or local authorities can borrow at through accessing the Public Works Loans Board. But in terms of the review as a whole, it's an enormous missed opportunity not to be looking at international best practice, at models of ownership. And the government's announced that it wants to deliver a water system that is climate resilient, that is fit for the 21st century, that is fair for bill payers, and that will lead to improved environmental outcomes. And yet it has deliberately chosen to ignore ownership as potentially something that might be influencing all of these other outcomes. And it's interesting to look at the government's partial renationalisation of the national grid. And in announcing this partial renationalisation of the national grid, it has said that it's doing this to deliver its ambitions under the Climate Change Act, to deliver net zero, to ensure fair outcomes for electricity bill payers, but it refuses to do this for the water industry. So one is left wondering, why won't the government look at public ownership? And all I can conclude is that we are the only country in the world, apart from Chile, that has a fully privatised water system. The 35 years of this system, I think, have been an abject failure. They've delivered terrible environmental performance, high bills for customers, next to no real investment. And we really ought to be looking at the root cause of the crisis that we're facing if we are to move forward with solutions. So I would have loved to have seen a review that looks at some of these international models, that looks at what happened in Paris. And what you didn't mention was that the year after Eau de Paris was remunicipalised, bills fell by 9%. And fast forward to the Paris Olympics in 2024, and the open water swimming event is held in the River Seine. I mean, it is inconceivable, absolutely inconceivable that that could happen in London now. It's simply, literally, people would die. So, I mean, and yet we go back 100 years, and there used to be a floating swimming baths moored just here at Waterloo Bridge.
Oh wow! Well, those were the days.
Yes, they were in the day. So I want that review to look at models of ownership around the world, to look at international best practice, to benchmark ourselves on environmental performance, on value for money, on investment against other countries, and let's see who wins. And I guarantee you it won't be us. But the other thing I want to sort of talk about a little bit as well, because this goes to my campaigning work and my sort of love of swimming. One of my fellow Henley Mermaids is here as well. Is that we used to have dozens of public bathing areas lining the banks of the River Thames, and these were prominent municipal features. You used to go to your public swimming baths. There were several in Oxford. They were all right the way through to London, one at Teddington. And this was a prominent feature of municipal life. And by the end of the 1990s, they were all closed down. So we've forgotten that rivers are places for swimming, that they are places for people to enjoy, they're places for nature. And if you go to any of these countries that have really good environmental performance, if you go to Switzerland, you can swim in the centre of Zurich, in one of several swimming baths with disabled access. If you go to Munich, you can swim in the River Isar, which runs through the centre of Munich. Some of you might have done it. You leap into fast flowing water, you get dragged downstream at high speed, and you get out and you do the whole thing again. It's completely normal to swim in rivers. The idea that we have here, that it's dangerous, that you're going to get sick, stay away from the water, we're kind of weird in that regard. Elsewhere in Europe, they're all swimming in their rivers, and I would suggest that one of the reasons for that might be that they haven't suffered 35 years of underinvestment in their sewage infrastructure, because they don't have a privatised system, they don't have shareholders to pay.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you for starting off. Questions or comments? Who would like to begin? Please, and do introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kat Boxall. I'm a district councillor in Oxfordshire, so I know Jo through council work. And I used to work here, so it's
welcome back.
Slightly weird to be back in this room where I used to teach British Empire. Anyway, I have a million questions. One of to kind of stay on this international model is one of the features of places like Germany is that they have much bigger consolidated sewage treatment, and I wonder about the implications for us if you were to start saying that the thing that makes it financially more viable is that you're treating the sewage of tens of thousands of people, whereas we have, if you look at the sewage map of the Thames Valley, every little village or every other village has its own little tiny sewage works, and quite often they were built in the 1960s and nothing has been done since. So there are very big implications if we're going to start looking at international best practice. You start saying, actually, we need to put a sewage works for 75,000 people somewhere between, say, Oxford and Swindon. Where are you going to put it? So I just wondered if it's that question of scale and how do we get, is that going to be a big problem if we look at these models?
I don't know the answer to that. Jo, would you like to?
Well, the question are you asking is how do you deliver the sewage infrastructure that we need? I mean, it's a question of investment.
Yeah.
It's a question of looking at international deciding what works here. We have a different kind of geography to France or Germany. We're a much smaller country, a much more concentrated population. I don't think that you necessarily have to have economies of scale to deal with sewage. I think you just have to have investment to ensure that as and when this, I mean, you know this from Shriving, it's dealing with a very small population, but it just hasn't had any money spent on it at all. So I'm not sure that we need big, enormous solutions, you know, billions being spent on huge new sewage plants, although clearly that is happening in London. But rather, I mean, one of the problems with what we've had over the last 35 years is a total lack of basic maintenance. I mean, so we're not even talking about big ticket items, big investment. We're talking about basic maintenance. I did a tour of the Henley sewage treatment works last month, and what struck me about it was that it hasn't been touched since the 1960s. It's like going to Pripyat in Ukraine, you know, which is the abandoned Soviet-era town with, you know, after the Chernobyl reactor exploding. Literally, the thing is pristine 1960s municipal architecture, and it hasn't been touched. And you know, the population of Henley has more than quadrupled since the 1960s, but there's been no additional capacity put into that sewage treatment works. So, yeah, I think the question is one of investment, but it's more basic than that. It's almost just one of maintenance.
And population increase without the increased investment is one of the core issues.
Yeah,
Why have we got more sewage leaking? Well, because there's more people going to the toilet than that there has been before. And I mean, I suppose the way I would see it is it's just a technical question about like where to build new sewage plants, and there are engineers who are going to have answers to that. But what they don't have at the moment is money to spend so that they can deliver on the answers. I went to the where is it? It's down in southeast London. A huge old Victorian.
Robden? No.
It's an old Victorian sewage works, and it's like a palace.
Yeah.
It's like incredible decorations, arches, and everything. And you know, when they really, and this was happening 150 years ago. And the idea that we can't do something similar to get clean water now is beyond me. But yeah, so 40% more capital expenditure is what we could have if the money wasn't going to shareholders. And the other point, I suppose, to note is that in a way our water companies are nationalised already. It's just not by our own government. It's like the Kuwaiti government, Abu Dhabi, China, because you know their sovereign wealth funds and their investment banks, which are state entities, own Thames Water and a bunch of others. So everyone can own our water except us.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
More questions, comments? None at all? Yeah, Danny.
I suppose actually just going off that point Matt, you mentioned about, I think I mentioned about, I think it's the sort of the old infrastructure and comparison to with the Ukraine, that I guess maybe this is rather stark difference between the two, however, that although a lot of the former Eastern European, former Soviet republics usually have fairly old and outdated infrastructure, on the other hand, there's a stark contrast in the sense that those places do surprisingly have fairly decent water quality. So I guess there's also
Bulgaria, Romania. Yep.
So I guess just to that end is just a question of I suppose why is there a matter of maintenance of that infrastructure as well, the quality of the maintenance, and perhaps what other factors might lead to even in the context of the open infrastructure, the UK isn't doing very well.
Would you like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, and I think the reason for that is, as Ewan said, you know, we've been paying out, how much is it now? £80 billion?
85.2 billion.
85.2 billion has been paid out to shareholders. You know, that is money that could have gone into infrastructure. If you go to Switzerland again, you know, you'll get tertiary sewage treatment, which takes out fecal bacteria, and now they're installing a fourth level of treatment, which removes microplastics and hormones and drugs, recreational drugs. So they're so far beyond where we are. We're not even doing primary treatment of our sewage. We're literally not even doing that. So yeah, I think the issue really is that we've given 85.2 billion pounds to shareholders, including, you know, Abu Dhabi, the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund, the government of Queensland. You know, everyone's, as Ewan said, everyone seems to have a piece of our water except for us.
Yes. So I think one answer, if we look at this chart, and this is why I did it this way, is ownership. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But I mean, then what really is interesting is what's the difference between these countries up here, you know, on that axis. So now, you know, one reason why Bulgaria is spending a lot less money than Denmark is because of GDP per capita, because, you know, it's a lower GDP across the board. But you know, then if you sort of compare Finland and Denmark, countries of relatively equal GDP per capita, so Finland seems to be doing something interesting and better, and that's where the governance probably comes in. You know, so who's on the board of the water companies? What kind of oversight does government exercise? What does the regulator do? What powers does they have? And that's where I think fun for academics and empirical work needs to be done a lot more. And we're only just starting to understand these things with the global picture because the data's really good. So the next thing is to look at differences in the world.
I mean, that's something that could be done with the stroke of a pen tomorrow. We could democratise water, even if we kept it in private ownership. We could democratise it by having bill payers, i.e. customers or water users, councillors or local authority representatives, employees. You know, as you suggested, we could do that tomorrow without any changes really to anything to ownership at all. But government has been resistant to that. You know, there are a range of other things that could happen. I mean, you suggested reform to the duties of Ofwat to delete the duty to ensure reasonable returns to shareholders and to replace that duty with duties to people and nature. But again, government declined to do that, but they added this sort of duty to have regard to the Climate Change Act and the Environment Act, which is, well, the fact that the water industry has said nothing about it suggests that it's meaningless.
Yeah.
I mean, if they were worried about it, they would have kicked up a fuss. So there are a whole lot of things that could happen tomorrow. One thing that is quite concerning is that, you know, over the course of the past 12 years or so or more, since 2010, we've seen the number of prosecutions by the Environment Agency fall off a cliff. I mean, they've fallen by about 90%.
Yeah.
And that's coincided with, you know, the cuts to the Environment Agency's budget. And now we've got the government saying that it wants to further cut DEFRA's budget. DEFRA is the boss of the Environment Agency, and has asked DEFRA to find 20% worth of cuts. I mean, it's not adding up. So
Yeah.
we need to have a regulator that has enough resource to be able to enforce the law. We know at the moment that the Environment Agency will only investigate Category 1 pollution incidents. So that is mass fish death, mass pollution. Some dramatic, you know, horrific pollution incident is the only thing that they'll investigate. But most of what we see in our rivers, lakes and seas is the gradual drip, drip, drip of sewage or other pollution. And that's not Category 1, that's Category 2 or 3, but the cumulative impact of, you know, consistent phosphorus, consistent ammonia, consistent nitrates has a devastating impact on ecosystems and on rivers and on human health as well.
Great. And I just wanted to add one thing, which is that if the Special Measures Bill passes, the government would be able to change governance by regulation, it seems. It wouldn't have to pass a new Act of Parliament. So something could be done to change Scottish water, Welsh water, but then also United Utilities and the rest to put stakeholders on board if the government's interested. Are there any final questions or comments? Yes, go for it.
I just wondered, so how do we get people on side? So when we think about the general election we just had, I didn't really hear it come up by the main parties. And you have actually in all sort of I'm thinking of three major parties, but also the Greens as well. Each sort of ideology has some sort of preference to preserving equality of access in a conservative sense to conserving the environment. How do you tap into those for us in here listening to this presentation, it's absolutely crazy. But how do you solve that?
There were quite a few Lib Dem seats that were won. I mean, I was really struck. You know, Ed Davies falling into, that was one of his stunts, to fall into Lake Windermere, right?
Yeah, and he fell into the Thames at Goring as well. Yeah, he was launching himself into water bodies up and down the country. No, I mean, I don't agree necessarily, James. I think that actually the election, particularly in the sort of home counties, in the so-called blue wall seats around, you know, Oxfordshire, Berkshire, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, those places overwhelmingly went Lib Dem, and one of the biggest issues that prompted people to vote for the Liberal Democrats was the issue of water. Although what the Lib Dems are proposing on water is anyone's guess, I think it's unclear to me. I think they're proposing that water be run by special interest companies, which are companies that can still private companies that generate profit, but which are required to have regard to other factors such as the environment. Is that right?
Yeah, public benefit corporations,
Yes,
something like where the duties of the directors are for things which are not just about shareholder value, yet they still are appointed and removed, are ultimately accountable to shareholders. So, I mean, it's not really changing. If we sort of ask, does it belong here, here, or here? The answer is it's still up there.
Yeah. But in terms of getting this message to the general public, well, 82% of the public wants water to be in public ownership. It's government that's behind. You know, and once again, it's a case of our leaders are not really leading. This is coming from ordinary people. But I suppose when we go and talk to MPs, the biggest concern they have around bringing water back into public ownership is that we can't afford it. And this figure of £90 billion is continually sort of rolled out. But that's been consistently debunked. It will not cost £90 billion, even if you were to want to renationalise the whole water industry overnight. I think Moody's, the ratings agency, put the figure at something like £14 billion. And that figure is probably coming down by the day as these companies are going into more and more financial distress. So I think that the figures around the cost of renationalisation are inflated, and the figures around the cost of keeping water in private ownership are massively understated. And I think the key is that we need to get the message out there that privatisation has been a scam, that we are all being ripped off and have been ripped off for many years now, and that the cost is not only to us, but to our environment, to our rivers, and at some point we need to say time's up. Let's make a change.
Well, time's up.
Yeah, time's up.
Thank you so much. That's been absolutely brilliant. Actually, really, really wonderful. Round of applause. Thank you very much. And next week we will be doing the NHS, a little bit on governance, more about privatisation there, and even a touch on the Hippocratic Oath. I look forward to seeing you. No, that's all right. There's so much more to say about agriculture, and I just wanted to touch on it. Oh, that's Can I get you a drink? Thanks very much, Mum. Hi, how's it going? Hi, Mum. Oh, really? I might want to check my emails. Which organisation are you from? Great. Yeah, I was talking to some of your colleagues the other day because one of the water campaigns asked me to come in. Sorry, let me just turn this off and then. Do you work in this sort of stuff?
Well, no, like mostly my private stuff. about mitigation, which is kind of this UN Supreme Court judgment I think we funded, I think, the Manchester Crops. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know range of I don't know any of it.
That's right.
We'll
give you my
Nice to meet you.
He
You live there too?
Yeah.
Who lives in the
He works in the public law, so
Yeah, and then yes, that's the Windrush against sewage pollution group was talking about like judicial officers. I think the idea was just like, can we think of anything? We'll try and do it.
exactly. So we're looking at like representing communities against compensation and against what's so they're not used as private nuisance and public nuisance.
Sure.
Tourism as a result, and
He's phenomenal.
Okay.
I don't know, I think
Anything on structural change?
Right,
well, that's not our area.
we're going for a beer. Do you want to come?
Yeah, I'll try.
Where do we need to go?
I would suggest the
James?
Lyceum, if you don't
The
mind.
Lyceum, is that where you're going to
I'm easy. Where is the Lyceum?
I'll show you.
Anyway, I just wanted to say,
Oh, yeah.
fascinating.
Well,
Yeah.
I was a postdoc here.
I'll send around you signed up on the event.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll send you down this.
The whole of the British Empire for 500 years in
Yeah, and if there's anything.
I made a migration